The 15th Amendment declared that all male citizens had the right to vote and could not have that taken away from them based on race, creed, or previous condition of servitude. This right affected all men in the United States, no matter their race, belief, or even where they lived. The Southern states were required to write new constitutions or laws that allowed African Americans to vote. But some Southerners, who are known as critics, claim that the only reason Congress passed the 15th Amendment was to protect the Republicans in Congress. This motive to protect the Republicans was certainly helpful in passing the 15th Amendment. But as a result, African Americans were able to vote. They were able to hold political office and were elected to state legislators as well as congressional delegations. Although the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were created to protect the rights of African Americans, they were only effective if the Republicans had control of state governments because they believed that African Americans deserved rights. In addition, these amendments were only effective if the federal troops were able to protect the African Americans. If they were not there to protect the African Americans, then they could be in trouble with subversive groups like the Ku Klux Klan. But there were no laws that were passed that allowed African Americans to own land. Even if the freedmen had money to purchase it, many Southerners refused to sell them land. As a result, they still relied on whites for making money and were not economically independent of the white Southerners. They also had to rely on them because they needed to provide for themselves and their loved ones. African Americans continued to try to own land, but for the most part they were very unsuccessful. General Sherman advocated for them and offered African Americans who fought in the Civil War 40 acres and a mule. However, many African Americans were often intimidated and did not take up on this promise. Then President Johnson and the federal government took control of the land that had been taken previously from the Confederates and given to these freedmen and gave it back to white landowners. They did this because they respected the rights of the whites being able to own land. Most freedmen also had no money to purchase land and had little opportunity to work for wages since there was only a small amount of currency available in the South. As a result, many freedmen entered into agreements with landowners known as sharecropping. In exchange for the right to work the land, many African Americans, as well as poor, landless whites, would work the land in exchange for a portion of the crops that they grew.